Hello, I'm Michael Brown, President of the School for Advanced Research in Santa Fe, and it is my great pleasure to be your host for this third online Salon series, The Interpretation of Ancestral Pueblo Rock Art by Dr. Severin Fowles. We'll be organizing events like this at least once a month, focused on a wide range of topics intended to enlighten and provide new insights into topics of broad social concern. So check with the SAR website, the calendar on our website, sarweb.org, and your email inboxes for updates. This is part of our ongoing effort to stay connected with our members during a time of social distancing. We're grateful to the School for Advanced Research Founders Society members who provide the financial support for our creative thought form, of which this is a part. We also appreciate the support of our members and donors who help us continue to deliver quality online program. A couple of logistical items before we start. Typically to the right of your screen, I'm guessing here, since not everybody has the same type of screen, you'll see a control panel. And when we get to the Q&A part of the event, you'll see that you can either submit questions through the questions function in the panel, or if you have a microphone on your computer, you can raise your hand electronically. And Lindsay Archuleta, who's the Wizard of Oz in these events behind the scenes, she will be forwarding me the questions and also allowing people to speak if they request to do so. The program today is a little bit longer than usual, so we won't be able to take as many questions as normal. We'll probably wrap up at about the 75-minute mark, which would be 3:15 Mountain Time. Now it's my pleasure to introduce Professor Severin Fowles. There he is, sitting in the president's office at the School for Advanced Research, which some of you will recognize. Severin is Associate Professor of Anthropology and Chair of the American Studies Program at Barnard College, and a former Weatherhead Resident Scholar at SAR. As an archaeologist, his work examines the images, countercultures, religions, indigenous worlds, and colonial histories of the American Southwest. He's directed a wide range of really interesting fieldwork projects in New Mexico, from excavations of a 13th century ancestral Pueblo village to rock art surveys in the Rio Grande del Norte National Monument, to excavations at a Spanish colonial village, to excavations of a 1960s hippie commune, which the results for which I'd like to hear about someday, but not today. His work prioritizes collaboration with descendant communities, most recently with Picaris Pueblos and the Comanche Nation, the latter project resulting in a recent PBS documentary on the tribe's 18th century rock art traditions. His works include An Archaeology of Doings, Secularism, and the Study of Pueblo Religion, published by SAR in 2013, as well as the Oxford Handbook of Southwest Archaeology, published by Oxford University Press in 2017, which Severin assures me is the largest book ever published in Southwestern archaeology. Welcome, Severin Fowles, and I'll do a handoff to you now.
Great, thanks so much, Michael, for that really nice introduction. And I really want to express my sincere gratitude to SAR for everything it does as an institution to promote anthropological research, all over the world, but especially scholarship based right here on Pueblo land in the Rio Grande Valley. I've always admired how SAR holds to that old 1970s environmentalist mandate to think globally while acting locally. And really, I've actually designed my talk today very much in that same SAR spirit. Thinking globally, I am interested in the art or visual culture of what archaeologists typically refer to as the Neolithic Revolution. Simply put, farming had a transformative effect on how people created images all over the world. And I'm fascinated by the fact that when we look out across that global human experience of nurturing plants and animals, when we look to that world database, in other words, there are some striking similarities, patterns in the way that village-based farmers came to engage with images, which is something that I've written about in a few other contexts. So on one hand, I'm interested in this global relationship between food production and image production. And at this point, I'm going to actually share my screen and show you a few slides, if I can. But I'm also interested in the much more specific history of rock art in the Southwest, and in how farming transformed image production right here in New Mexico. And it's this local history that I'll be primarily considering today. Now, in the process, I'm going to be setting up a somewhat simplified contrast between Pueblo rock art, the rock art of farmers, which began to slowly spread across the Southwest at some point after about 4,000 years ago, between Pueblo rock art and what archaeologists typically refer to as archaic rock art, which is a term we use to talk about the much older imagery produced by hunters and gatherers during the long millennia prior to the spread of agriculture. Now, this archaic to Pueblo transition is complicated. It stands at the heart of a great many fascinating historical questions, and archaeologists have spent an especially large amount of time thinking about this transition from an economic perspective. Indeed, our dominant understanding of the archaic to Pueblo transition is as an economic revolution from foraging to farming. And you know, we have a whole language to describe this. We talk about the domestication of plants and animals, the intensification of farming through the construction of water management systems. We talk about the aggregation of human communities into villages in response to new agricultural surpluses. And we talk about the integration of these villages through various systems of governance. Again, to put it bluntly, this is the Southwest version of the Neolithic Revolution. And again, it's overwhelmingly talked about in economic terms. But the archaic to Pueblo transition also involved a dramatic iconographic revolution, a revolution in image production that went hand in hand with the revolution in food production. Far less attention has been given to this second revolution. We don't even have an adequate or equivalent language to talk about what this change entailed. And it's really one of my goals in this talk to begin to develop that language. Okay, so it's a tale of two revolutions that I'll be telling then. Two revolutions that combined to create what our Pueblo colleagues sometimes refer to as the corn lifeway. Corn or maize, of course, being central to farming as it evolved in this part of the world. And if you're interested in exploring this notion of the corn lifeway further, you can, of course, just talk to my long-term advisor, Dick Ford, who knows just about as much as any non-native person could about this topic. But I'll also direct you to the writings of Dorothy Washburn, who's worked closely with Hopi colleagues to produce some really insightful scholarship that I'll return to in a moment. Okay, with that as an introduction, let's dive into the rock art itself. Now, an SAR audience doesn't need to be told, where the American Southwest is or where the Ancestral Pueblo region is. Most of you live right smack in the middle of it. You're all well aware that Ancestral Pueblo folks dwelt historically across a wide swath of northern New Mexico and Arizona, extending into Colorado and Utah. And I'm guessing that most of you are also familiar with the Rio Grande Gorge in north central New Mexico, just west of Taos. That's my neighborhood, if you like, my research neighborhood at least. Indeed, I've been co-directing a rock art survey in the Gorge for the past 13 years in collaboration with three wonderful colleagues, Lindsay Montgomery of the University of Arizona, Daryl Wilkinson of Dartmouth College, Ben Alberti of Framingham State University. And most of the images I'll be sharing with you come from this study area and from the research we've been collectively pursuing. Now, the Gorge itself is a beautiful place to work, although it's quite a rugged landscape filled with endless basalt surfaces. And as you might expect, finding rock art in this sort of setting can be pretty challenging. Somewhat sadistically, I have to admit that I love throwing my Barnard students out into this landscape. If you've got good eyes, you'll be able to just make out 4 distraught crew members scrambling about, examining every rock face on this talus slope. It's not easy work, but all those years of twisted ankles have paid off. To date, we've recorded over 5,000 panels. which is to say we've filled out over 5,000 forms and produced a lot of rock art tracings and other types of documentation. So what have we learned? Well, the first thing we've learned is that, as in most parts of the Southwest, the early or pre-agricultural rock art, which is to say the archaic rock art, looks a whole lot different from later Puebloan rock art. I'll address the age of this early imagery in a moment, but suffice it to say that its antiquity is immediately apparent in the dark patina that's reformed over the pecked surfaces. One often finds that lichen colonies have also grown over, eaten away, and obscured some of the glyphs over time. So there's a visible aging process that helps us establish at least a relative date for archaic art, even as it can make this sort of imagery quite difficult to see. In this panel, for instance, you may have already picked out a couple hoof prints over there on the left, but highlighting the pecked areas, we discover that there are actually 9 prints on this particular rock face. Indeed, animal tracks, both quadruped hoof prints and bird prints, animal tracks are among the most common archaic rock art elements in the gorge, as are human footprints, in fact. Here's another archaic panel, really difficult to see in this photograph. But highlighting the pecked areas again, you'll note that there are 4 heavily weathered human footprints here. I'll just share with you a couple more examples. In this archaic panel, a wavy starburst and a circle. And on this panel, many more circles and wavy lines. And this really is the other major pattern in archaic rock art. Alongside these tracks of deer, mountain sheep, humans, birds, and so on, we also find lots and lots of dots, squiggles, circles, and other geometric glyphs that folks often describe, incorrectly, I think, as abstract or non-representational. You'd have to look very carefully to see any traces of the archaic glyphs in this pictograph or this photograph. But here again, there's that classic mixture of tracks, footprints, and geometric glyphs. And I'll just share with you one final archaic panel from our research in the gorge, which, as you can see, a student has gridded off in preparation for documentation. And highlighting the fully repatinated peck marks, we again find a combination of tracks and perplexing geometric elements. Okay, so I'm fascinated by this material and I could blather on about it for hours, but mindful of time, I just want to make 2 quick points. First, regarding the question of how old these images are. Well, they're clearly old, clearly thousands of years old, but we can be a bit more precise than this. Indeed, we're really lucky to have at least a couple of actual chronometric dates from a nearby site on Roe Mesa, just outside of Santa Fe, where a large expanse of comparable archaic rock art has been found on the horizontal basalt bedrock, buried partially beneath sediment. And you can actually see some of that sediment if you look in the upper left portion of this photograph. Here's another archaic panel on Roe Mesa. Iconographically, we again see that characteristic mix of animal tracks and geometrics. And again, I'll draw your attention to the overlying sediment this time in the lower portion of the photo. Now that sediment is critical because archaeologists have collected radiocarbon samples that clearly establish that the sediment is 5,000 years old, which means that the rock art underneath it has to be more than 5,000 years old. And of course, this is well before agriculture arrived in the Rio Grande Valley. It effectively places this imagery in what we'd consider the middle archaic period. Okay, so that's the first point. Archaic rock art really is a coherent tradition produced for thousands of years prior to the arrival of agriculture. Now, the second point I want to make has to do with the interpretation of archaic rock art. I gave a lecture in Santa Fe on this topic a couple of years ago, and the wonderful native cartoonist Ricardo Cate happened to be in the audience. And during my lecture, presumably, I'm guessing, during an especially boring part, Ricardo drew this cartoon, which he then gave me as a gift afterwards. Right, so it's obviously poking fun at white archaeologists like myself who seem to be foolishly obsessed with the question of what indigenous rock art means. Is it a rake, a broom, a comb? These Indians who are parodying white archaeologists debate as they look at an archaic rock art panel. Okay, well, in my own defense, there's a lot of complexity in archaic rock art that deserves some sort of explanation. Right, so I've here added a somewhat more representative archaic panel from our study area, though to my mind, this addition that I've made only amplifies the brilliance of Ricardo's original cartoon. It's a great cartoon to my mind because it so perfectly exposes the points I'd been trying to make in that lecture, namely that asking what archaic images are or mean is entirely the wrong question. The right question, I'd argue, is where do these images lead? After all, we're talking about images produced by hunters and gatherers who were exceptionally skilled in tracking game and in finding useful plants. They were exceptionally skilled in reading natural signs, in other words, signs that functioned indexically, in the sense that they pointed towards the object of interest. Which surely also helps us understand why archaic rock art, unlike later rock art, is so regularly found on horizontal surfaces, surfaces that are on or very close to the ground. This is a strong pattern in archaic rock art across a wide area, and it's a significant one, I think. And here I want to stress again that these images were produced and probably also read by hunters who were intimately accustomed to scrutinizing natural signs on the ground while tracking game. And I really would argue that it's appropriate to think about this early rock art as existing within the wider indexical language of animal prints, game trails, lines of scat, and the like. Okay, I've only opened a small window onto the rock art of archaic hunters and gatherers in the Rio Grande Valley, but similar early images can be found throughout most of the Southwest. Indeed, in this slide, I've reproduced the distribution of what Sally Cole described in her excellent 1990 book, Legacy on Stone, what she described as the quote-unquote abstract rock art tradition, which is the same thing I've been calling the archaic tradition. Back then, Cole was understandably uncertain about the starting date of the tradition. We now know it started well before 1000 BC. But she ended the tradition at 1000 CE, which is noteworthy insofar as this was broadly the time when agricultural intensification really locked in and took hold across most of the northern Southwest. And you can see that Cole understood archaic rock art as having been produced early on over quite a large region. But now I want to draw your attention to a much more recent book by Eckhart Malachy, and I apologize for potentially mispronouncing the last name here, by Eckhart Malachy and Ellen Desanayaki, published just 2 years ago, in which they tackle, as they put it, the Western archaic tradition. This is an interesting book. Indeed, it's the first extended treatment of archaic rock art that I know of. And as I've noted in this slide, the authors not only argue for a major geographic expansion of the tradition, effectively across all of Western North America, but also a significant temporal expansion, effectively back to the earliest occupation of the continent, effectively back into Paleo-Indian times. And they argue that as we look out through time and across space in this expansive tradition, a common question repeatedly arises, a question they gloss as the, quote, geometric enigma, unquote, which more or less translates into the question of why folks would have spent so much time and energy pecking all those perplexing dots and squiggles. Now, my answer to this question is different than theirs. As I've indicated, I think it centrally has to do with the pursuit of game and other means. Be that as it may, I'm grateful that they've inaugurated a continent-wide conversation, which I do think is really what's needed here. For indeed, this Western archaic pattern becomes all the more interesting when we turn to consider how it was transformed by the arrival of farming, as well as, quite likely, the arrival of a few actual migrants from the south. Now, most of you, I'm sure, know the corn or Lifeway as such, know that it originated in central Mexico, where maize was first domesticated. The history of maize's domestication is itself a complicated one, involving long-term morphological modifications to the wild teosinte plant. But by 5,000 years ago or so, a domesticate that we'd recognize as corn was present in Mesoamerica. And sometime shortly after 4,000 years ago, this key species began to appear far to the north. In this slide, I've included a few of the dates in radiocarbon years before present that have been reported from New Mexico and Arizona. Now, we shouldn't overinterpret a few early corn dates. All indications suggest that corn's introduction was patchy, that early foragers in many parts of the Southwest effectively rejected the whole idea of farming, and that in other areas, foragers only planted corn on a small scale as a supplement to their continued focus on hunting and gathering. A true commitment to farming would only take root more than a millennium after corn's introduction. But I want to set all of that complexity to the side and focus instead on the big picture, or on what an art historian might consider the big picture. Namely, that as farming traditions became established in the northern Southwest, they began to radically transform the prevailing Western archaic tradition of image production. In other words, as the ancestors of Pueblo people became committed to producing corn, they more or less simultaneously became committed to producing radically different sorts of images. This is the iconographic revolution we've been building towards. And it's a revolution that we can first begin to track in what archaeologists refer to as the basket maker II communities of the Four Corners region. Now, these basket maker communities effectively inaugurate the Pueblo tradition. They're farming, eating corn, living in fairly substantial pit houses, gradually adding pottery to their toolkits. In short, it's a time of major economic change in the northern Southwest. But let me jump right to the chase. It was also a time of major iconographic change, a time when stunning new images began to appear on rock faces. Not, mind you, on low horizontal surfaces, as was common in the rock art of archaic hunters, but rather on vertical and much more theatrical surfaces. And significantly, these images emphasized anthropomorphic bodies, a dramatic departure from the earlier archaic tradition, which in most areas was characterized by a widespread hesitancy in depicting actual bodies, particularly human bodies. This is a tradition that Polly Schaffsma defined back in the 1970s as the San Juan anthropomorphic style. And it's not subtle. However one might interpret all these anthropomorphs, and as you can imagine, there is plenty of debate. However we might interpret them, they clearly announce something quite new. They announce, I'd argue, a new set of understandings about what images are and how they function. Now, during the early farming period, during these early basket maker times, the sorts of economic and iconographic transformations that were happening with special intensity in the northern San Juan region hadn't yet impacted the Rio Grande Gorge where I work. In fact, the entire northern Rio Grande Valley was still a landscape of archaic hunters and gatherers, well outside the emerging Pueblo tradition to the west. But as we move through time, through what archaeologists refer to as the Basket Maker III period, through the Pueblo I period, and into the Pueblo II or Chacoan period, the corn lifeway of the Pueblos not only expanded and formalized, it also got closer and closer to the Rio Grande Gorge. Of course, there was a bit of farming here and there in the Rio Grande Valley prior to the Pueblo II period, but it was really during the 10th and 11th centuries when part-time farmers began to first establish small homesteads in and around the gorge itself. And it wasn't until the Pueblo III period, between about 1150 and 1300 CE, that the gorge, my own study area, came to be fully incorporated into the Pueblo world, and also into its growing traditions of economic and iconographic production. And this has proven to be surprisingly useful, because it's permitted us to examine the Archaic to Pueblo transition as a more sharply demarcated contrast than in many other parts of the Southwest. And this has served to underscore just how different the images of farmers were when compared with the images of the preceding foragers. So let's now turn to consider the ancestral Pueblo rock art of the Rio Grande Gorge and try to define more precisely just how it was revolutionary. So this is an image of one of those Pueblo panels in the gorge. It too is difficult to see, but this time that's not due to weathering or aging. Rather, it's because the panel was just very lightly pecked. I've highlighted the peck marks in this slide, however, and you can see already that we're dealing with a very different sort of image. Now, if asking, what is it? What does it mean? If asking these questions was a somewhat comical undertaking in the context of archaic rock art, now these questions become not only reasonable, I think, but also necessary. In fact, in the case of this particular panel, I'd argue that at a basic level, what we're looking at is an image of the corn lifeway itself. Now let me walk you through the image to explain what I mean here. And I'd like to work with our tracing of this image to do so, starting with the glyphic element at the top, which I've highlighted for you here in red. Now this is an interesting element insofar as it incorporates the natural topography of the rock. And if we go back to a photographic detail, we see that the artist has accentuated an exfoliated portion of the panel surface by adding a lightning arrow, the tip of which just touches that small spalled off area. And it doesn't take much to imagine that the artist here is trying to convey a sense of lightning striking the boulder itself. This is significant because within Pueblo theological discourses, really across the Southwest, there's a recurrent association of lightning strikes with fertilization. The idea being that this is a way that the sky father inseminates or makes fertile the earth mother. So we can conclude that on some level, this is what the upper glyph means. It has something to do with insemination or fertilization. Moving down into the center of the panel, we encounter what appears to be a masked figure. I've highlighted the mask in red. Now, I've not yet discussed this panel with any of my Pueblo colleagues, some of whom I suspect would immediately recognize this image in quite specific terms. We seem to be looking at a one-horned Kachina mask, and while I couldn't tell you the name of the Kachina or the specific ceremonies it figures in, there are some interesting interpretive opportunities when we consider the mask's formal appearance. And here is where I'd like to draw directly from that article by Dorothy Washburn on the corn lifeway that I cited a bit ago. What you're looking at in this slide are two illustrations from Washburn's article, illustrations that she used to draw the reader's attention to a very widespread iconographic focus throughout much of the Americas, an iconographic focus on the germination of corn, and even more specifically, on the curl of the first sprout that comes out of the germinating seed. So here for comparison, I offer you a photographic sequence of the early germination of a corn seed. And Washburn's argument is that this germinating sprout curl was incorporated into a great deal of corn-based iconography throughout the Americas. For instance, this curl regularly appears coming off the forehead of the Mayan maize god. And Washburn, in fact, traces this basic glyph all the way north into the ancestral Pueblo region, which gives us license to speculate, I think, that something similar might be going on in this Pueblo mask image from the gorge. Indeed, the curving horn of the mask iconically resembles the germinating corn seed, and one might even interpret the feathers hanging down from the horn as references to those little rootlets that grow out during the germination process. I'm going to speculate then that the mask on some level is making reference to the germination of corn. As we move throughout the panel, we can add other interpretive details. There seems to be a ground line represented, for instance, below which both the female figure and the bird seem to be taking root. The body of the anthropomorphic figure herself could be interpreted as representing a mature ear of corn or maize. Indeed, ideas about corn maidens are widely shared across the Pueblo world, as are symbolic associations between femininity, fertility, motherhood, and mature ears of corn. This is the sort of symbolism, for instance, that stands behind the corn maiden figurine from nearby Picary's Pueblo that I've included as a comparative image on the left. And we don't need to go too deeply into this belief system to draw the simple conclusion that the female figure in the rock art panel probably also has something to do with maturing ears of corn. Okay, the last iconographic detail is that turkey over there on the left. Significantly, a turkey that's been depicted as if it were about to consume the feminized corn body. Now, turkeys were also part of the Ancestral Pueblo agricultural complex, having been domesticated at some point prior to 2,000 years ago, and having been clearly raised on Pueblo corn in some regions since basket maker 2 times. In this image, the artist even seems to have depicted the turkey with clipped wings, which is a detail that I find really, really fascinating. Regardless, since we're speculating, let's imagine that this turkey is being used as a symbol of the Pueblo community, which, like the turkey, subsists on corn. Okay, putting this all together, what we're presented with is an iconographic depiction of the sequence of the corn lifeway itself, from fertilization to maturation to consumption. And while the interpretation I've offered may be wrong or incomplete in places, what is clear, I hope, is that Ancestral Pueblo images, unlike archaic images, invite the question, what is it? What does it mean? These are images that really were designed to be identified. But let's take things a step further. From a formal art historical perspective, the Pueblo iconographic revolution really did involve much, much more than this. Pueblo images of birds, for example, can be said to have replaced archaic images of bird tracks, the illustration on the right being the tracing of another characteristic archaic panel from our survey area. Phrased in more general terms, we might say that bodies replaced traces of bodies. And let's really stop and register the significance of this for a moment. Despite the hundreds of archaic bird tracks we've recorded in our surveys, we have never once encountered an actual archaic bird. For thousands of years, birds were only depicted in rock art by their trace, by the mark that they leave behind. And then suddenly, with the arrival of Pueblo farmers, actual images of bird bodies proliferated. In semiotic terms, one might further say that Pueblo icons replaced archaic indexes. The Pueblo image on the left looks like a bird. It signifies iconically. But the trident-like glyphs on the right don't actually look like birds. Rather, they look like the effects of a bird's former presence. A semiotician would say that those tracks have not an iconic, but a cause and effect relationship with birds. If they signify bird, then this is only in an indexical sense. But let's not get hung up on jargon. There are some simpler, but no less significant observations to make about the revolutionary nature of Pueblo rock art. Consider another panel from the Gorge that prominently includes bird icons. You're looking at a field photo in this slide with one of my students included to give you a sense of scale. And for clarity's sake, I'd like to work again from our tracing of the panel, which actually includes 2 sets of glyphs, the original Pueblo glyph in black, and then some more recent Catholic editions in the halftone. So let's remove those later editions and focus solely on the Pueblo imagery. A stepped cloud, lightning, a corn plant growing out of a bowl. There is a lot to talk about here, but I want to draw your attention solely to the birds. Not only do we encounter bird as an iconic body, we also are provided with 3 different perspectives on the bird body all at once. a side view on the right, and also what we might interpret as back and belly views in the center and left, which is to say that there's an implied three-dimensionality, a sense that one could walk around the image, the body, and see it from multiple perspectives. And this is true not only in the case of Pueblo bird imagery. In this slide you're looking at on the right, an archaic panel within which there are lots of wavy and serpentine lines. This is another very common archaic glyphic element. Now, the Pueblo rock art of the Gorge also has lots of serpentine lines, but as you can see in the Pueblo panel on the left, many of these have been transformed from geometric patterns into actual serpents. In this case, a horned serpent, seemingly with a rattlesnake tail. And here I'd ask that you take note of how in the archaic imagery, it doesn't make sense to ask what side of the glyphs we're looking at, right? There are no alternative perspectives we might adopt when talking about a wavy line or a sequence of dots. But in the case of the Pueblo serpent on the left, there's no question that we're looking at its right side, and that this body would necessarily look somewhat different if approached from another perspective. This comes out clearly in another Pueblo panel in the Gorge that features horned serpents. Note how, once again, there seems to be a self-consciousness about perspective here. In the middle, we encounter that canonical right side view of the serpent. But below it, we see another serpent rising up, exposing now to us its left side. And in the upper right of the panel, we encounter what appears to be either the back or belly view of a serpent. From this latter perspective, the mouth is hidden, but we're able finally to see that the artist had in mind a serpentine body with two horns rather than just one. A related observation can be made about something like concentric circle glyphs. Such glyphs are very common in archaic rock art. On the right, for instance, we're looking at a fully repatinated archaic panel. It's a simple image with an isolated set of concentric circles. And on the left, we're looking at a Pueblo panel with that same basic glyph. But here we find some key additions. Two legs extending down from the bottom, a spear peeking out on the left and right sides. And while it's difficult to see in this photo, there's also a simple head added to the top. It's a shield bearer, of course, a classic Pueblo image. A Pueblo artist then has taken an ancient geometric form and presented it instead as a shield. And consider what's been accomplished in the process. When we look at the circles on their own, as they appear in archaic rock art, it doesn't make sense to ask what perspective we're viewing the image from. There is no back to this image, in other words. But as soon as we add a head, legs, and a hand, look what happens. Those small additions suffice to immediately change this into a glyph with multiple potential perspectives. Suddenly, we can imagine a back into the image that would look very different than this frontal view. And that's true, of course, of Pueblo shield bearers generally. Now, I've cheated here and shared with you a series of remarkable panels that come from a short distance south of my study area in the Gorge. These are classic examples of Pueblo IV period rock art that many of you might recognize. The point I'd like to make here is that in each case, we're immediately aware that we're looking at the front of a shield. And moreover, we're immediately able to imagine walking around behind the image to view the body of the bearer that the shield obscures. I have to say that I also like these panels because as much as we might think about them, as bold warriors holding shields, they're also clearly images of artists holding beautiful aesthetic objects. And here, I couldn't help but draw a connection to this photo on the left that was posted on Reddit a few months ago. This is an image of a woman. Her name is Cindy Decker. She's a teacher in Jacksonville, Florida, and she's proudly holding a painting she's just created. Now, this interests me partly because, it abruptly forces us into a new reading of the shield-bearing warriors as image producers, holding aloft, proudly we might imagine, their own works of art. But Cindy Decker's image further interests me insofar as it became something of an internet phenomenon. When this fellow in Sweden saw the photograph and painted it as a picture in a picture. After which, as you might guess, this woman created a picture of the picture of the picture. This is what art historians refer to as the Drost effect. And I might add that, apparently there are now more than 40 painted iterations of the image, with the unsuspecting Cindy Decker getting tinier and tinier in each one. Just gotta love the internet. Anyway, we might also call these meta pictures. Pictures of pictures, in other words, or rather pictures that are self-consciously commenting on the act of picture creation. And for those of you interested in thinking through such meta issues, I direct you to the classic text Picture Theory by W.J.T. Mitchell. That's had a big influence on my own work. Anyway, I firmly believe that Ancestral Pueblo images were at least as complicated and self-reflexive as the postmodern images that populate the web today. Just to underline this last point, consider the shield bearer once again. What we're looking at here, of course, is an image of a shield held aloft by a person, all of which has been depicted on a rock. But the image of the shield is itself composed of images. For instance, we can clearly make out the image of a star on the shield, held by the person on the rock. And if we really zoom in, we find that there's an image of a mask on the star that's on the shield that's held by the person that's been depicted on the rock. Right, so my point here is that Ancestral Pueblo rock art very much took part in its own meta-pictorial discourse. There's nothing simple about these images. And as an extension of this last point, consider the rock art panel in this photograph. It's a bit faint, so I've highlighted the pecked areas again for you here. And to facilitate our analysis, let's again turn to a tracing of the panel. Now, as you'll immediately note, this panel is again dominated by a shield bearer, but remarkably, it also includes a textual statement, the word Paho in a distinctive serif font, which is very, very unusual and suggests that this panel was created at some point during the late 19th or early 20th centuries, effectively making this the very latest datable Pueblo panel that we know of in our survey area. So what is Paho? Well, actually, it's a Hopi word for prayer stick. The implication being that this is the object that the warrior is holding. Paho is actually comprised of two Hopi words, pa for water and ho for arrow. And the metaphor that's implied here is that Pahos are like prayers for water, prayers that have been shot into the heavens like an arrow. Now, I don't think there's any question that this rock art panel qualifies as a kind of meta picture. It seems to be commenting on the different forms a Paho might take as material object, as written word, and even as utterance. For there is, in fact, a speech bubble coming from the figure's sideways mouth. This really marks this panel as unlike any other we've yet encountered. But there are other, more familiar iconographic elements here that we've seen before. There's a strong sense of a plurality of potential perspectives, for instance, seen both in the frontal view of the shield and also in the figure's head, which combines a front-facing set of eyes and nose along with a side-facing mouth. And there is that metapictorial sense of an image of an image. In this case, an image of a bird on an image of a shield on a rock. All of this should be familiar to us by now, as an inheritance of that original Pueblo revolution in images. But what about some of the other details in this panel? What in particular about that small anthropomorphic figure floating above the shield bearer? Well, if I was giving this talk 3 years ago, I actually wouldn't have had anything to say about that little figure, to be completely honest. But happily, I was recently out at Mesa Prieta, just south of the Gorge, with a Tewa colleague, who shared some really fascinating insights into how one might interpret the bodily posture of anthropomorphic figures like this one. And here I do want to add that although this colleague preferred to remain anonymous, he did generously give me permission to share the following insight with you, an insight which I don't think has actually yet made its way into the published literature. And it's this final insight that I want to use as a means of wrapping up the talk and of moving towards a conclusion. Now, this is the image he and I were discussing, an image of a Pueblo figure dancing with what looks like a horned serpent running across his waist, headdress and ceremonial objects in his hands. There are many details here, to be sure, that seem designed to be interpreted in a specific manner by those who have the responsibility of knowing such things. But it was the bodily posture that interests my colleague most. Within certain Tewa dances, he explained, the form that dancers' bodies assume are very meaningful. And in many instances, their bodies are regarded as assuming the images of clouds. Turning to this rock art panel, then he drew my attention to the extended and outreached arms, which from a Tewa perspective, he noted, would be interpreted as a dancer whose body was in the image of a rain cloud filled with moisture. And indeed, when one thinks about it in this way, it's quite easy to see this image as a human dancer who, like the rain clouds, is holding a great heavy quantity of water that's poised to shower down and bring fertility to the cornfields, and by virtue of this, to the community at large. An image of a human, in other words, in the image of life-bringing clouds. Now, I found this to be a truly stunning and indeed a truly beautiful insight, for it invites us to trace out this system of bodily signification of meaningful postures throughout our corpus of rock art in the Gorge. And not just in the Pueblo rock art that similarly depicts bodies with outstretched and upraised arms, as in these two examples, but also in panels with other bodies, with bodies, for example, that exhibit downturned arms, which now suddenly appear to us as iconically assuming the image of clouds that are actively releasing their moisture. In short, from this perspective, the Pueblo body becomes an icon in its own right, which is to say that the hundreds of anthropomorphic figures we've documented are transformed into images, not just of humans, but of humans who are themselves dancing in the images of clouds, or corn, or some other aspect of the new agricultural lifeway that this imagery developed in dialogue with. Even the humble toad could be thought of as participating in this tradition. For what is that rock art image on the left but a toad that is itself assuming the image of a dancing human with upraised arms? A toad that, by virtue of this, is also assuming the image of a cloud. Through the midst of the planted fields, when puddles form, the toads will be dancing as they make their cries, we learn from a Hopi song. Wak wak, they will say, mimicking humans in their singing and dancing. Okay, well, we've barely scratched the surface on the interpretation of ancestral Pueblo rock art. And if we had a second hour to think through this material together, we could easily pursue this topic a good deal further by considering, for instance, how so much of this imagery was more precisely created in the image of woven textile designs, created in the image of humans, in the image of clouds. But it's late and that conversation is for another time. And so instead, I thought I'd leave you with a painting by the famous Hopi artist Fred Capote, with his rendering of a Kachina dance at Shungapovi village out on the Hopi Second Mesa. It's a wonderful painting to think with. We see the maidens seated prominently in the middle, their bodies gathered together in the shape of mature ears of corn. We see the dancers circled around them, their bodies assuming the images of stepped clouds. And up there in the left-hand corner of the painting, we even see a congregation of birds alternately presenting to us their left side, their right side, their tail feathers, and so on. Now, thinking locally, what we're looking at, of course, is the corn lifeway, the product of 4,000 years, not just of increasing economic commitments to agriculture, but also of increasing aesthetic commitments to the images that went hand in hand with farming. And it's also a revolutionary image, at least when contrasted with the long history of archaic rock art production that preceded it. But from a global perspective, the Bodhi's painting also descends from a global story of the Neolithic, from a story of the reshaping of human worlds that took place when the pursuit of food by foragers gave way to the creation of food by farmers. And if this talk has accomplished anything, I hope it's convinced you of the need to attend to this global story as more than just one of economic transformation. I hope it's also convinced you to view it as a revolution in images as well. And with that, I will thank you very much and thank Michael for very kindly sharing his office with me, and we can return to our collective view and perhaps to the question and answer period. Thanks again.
Thank you so much, Sev. Wow, that's a lot to think about. I'm gonna start off on while we sort of review the questions coming in from our participants. I want to start with a really hard question. I suspect will be hard. So, what do these drawings do? I mean, you imply that the archaic drawings had a functional dimension, or at least that's your thinking, that it pointed, because many were horizontal, it pointed people towards resources. I presume that's not what you're saying about the Neolithic Ancestral Pueblo drawings. And, you know, one obvious interpretation would be that they're associated with sacred places, and clearly they are in some cases, but they're just hundreds of thousands of them, as you know better than almost anybody. And so it's hard to believe that every place where they occur is has some special significance. So the question of what, when you talk to Pueblo consultants, what do they say, or do they say anything about what the artists themselves thought they were doing when they were depicting these things?
Yeah, no, that's such a great and important question. You know, I think there's probably a lot of answers, and I think you would encounter a lot of answers from Pueblo community to Pueblo community, some that wouldn't be appropriate to share, others that would be. You know, I do think that archaic imagery, my interpretation of it was as a way of really kind of making a landscape knowledgeable, by adding to those natural signs that are already out there. And so I do think that they functioned as indexes to point you in directions. I see all really archaic imagery as like a whole bunch of arrows out there on the landscape. And that even includes arrows that point you towards what we would consider spiritual entities. There's a lot we could say about that. Mm-hmm. I do think Pueblo imagery, the imagery of farmers, actually not just in the Southwest, but around the world, functioned very differently. I mean, I think that it worked very differently. In a local Pueblo conception, we can easily talk about these as prayers, right? That's one way of talking about these images, as the equivalent to the Paho, like an arrow shot into the sky for rain. So we can imagine these as prayers. In the local area of the gorge itself, there's actually a really striking detail from Ancestral Taos ethnography. The word for pitcher in Tiwa translates as water line. And in some other work that I've been conducting, I've actually pivoted from that translation to think about these images as water lines in the infrastructural sense, as kind of like irrigation canals, as ways of opening up routes for moisture to arrive. So again, I think that there are a plurality of answers to how these things worked, these images. But I do think it's really, really different. They're kind of like technologies, like infrastructures, ecological infrastructures, I would say, for Pueblo people. And that's very different than archaic people engaged with the equivalent images.
Interesting. So I'm getting some questions here. There's one from Mary. Why were the serpents often depicted with horns?
I feel like I need to know whether this is Mary Wiyaki or someone else. Could you tell me who the last name is?
I don't see a last name, at least.
Okay, well, I'll apologize, Mary, if you're someone who knows perhaps more about this than I do. But why were the serpents depicted with horns? This is part of a deep Mesoamerican heritage that actually came up from the south. And you can trace this pattern even further north than the region that I'm talking about. So, why were they horned serpents? This is beyond my sort of realm of expertise. It's linked to complicated Mesoamerican traditions. It's linked to complicated theological understandings of water serpents as kind of deities within the Pueblo world. And I'm just going to leave it there, perhaps, and perhaps we could just go to the next question.
Okay. Mark asks or says, in the slides that had the serpents, there were plus or cross shapes. I've heard that these crosses represent a supernova that happened during the Pueblo III period. Is this true? Can you comment on these images, please?
Well, Polly Shaftsma, I think, is the best person to answer that question. She's looked at these and really thought about them, less about as kind of images of supernovas, but more as images of morning star, which is linked to warfare in a lot of Puebloan traditions. And indeed, I think, that particular serpentine image that you're referring to with those particular stars really does place that particular panel within a kind of military repertoire that we saw, for example, on that one shield bearer from just outside of Santa Fe that I shared with you. That also had those same stars on there. So rather than thinking about them as commemorating particular celestial events, I'd actually think it's much more plausible, and here I'm following Polly Shaftsma, in thinking about these as Venus, as morning star, as some of the celestial images that are linked to militarism in a general sense.
So there's a question from Frank that actually touches on this last point. He asked, are the shield symbols thought to represent actual warfare implements, or do they have a different meaning? Are they symbolic, or are they a kind of literal depiction?
Right. So I gave a talk about this at Southwest Seminar, gosh, was it this winter or the year before? So some of you, I apologize if I'm rehearsing some of the points there. I think that there's a lot more complexity to Pueblo shield bearers than we've recognized in the past. They've been interpreted in very muscular terms, as images of warfare, or of warriors at least, that's linked to warfare. And, while I wouldn't deny that, I was trying to be a bit playful in this presentation by contrasting it with, a middle-aged school teacher from Florida holding up her painting that she had just created. I want to force us to recognize that these shields were aesthetic objects, they were beautiful aesthetic objects, and I don't want to overly militarize them. I think that these aesthetic objects actually, just to jump right out there with the interpretation, did a great deal to transform the wearers, to transform the subjectivity of the wearers. I regard them as equivalent, as like masks for warriors, as ways of taking away their subjectivity, denying their own ability to braggartly, claim what they did on the battlefield, and instead to attribute it to the power of the shield, to the power of the images on the shield. So I relate this to what Ruth Benedict long ago referred to as the kind of Babylonianism of the Pueblo tradition, which I regard as a very beautiful aspect of the Pueblo tradition, a kind of humble, selfless stance.
But I would pick up on that by asking, I take your point about the shields, but I don't recall ever seeing a rock art image of a pot of ceramics, which is, of course, what we think of today as the ultimate expression of Pueblo aesthetics and artistry. So what do you make of that? Or maybe they're all over the place and I've never seen them, but I've seen a lot of rock art and don't recall ever seeing a depiction of a pot.
Right. So, this is such an, I'm just totally fascinated by the question of media right now and how media translate from one space to another. Like you might say that, well, there are some pots. Actually, one of the images that I showed you had what was probably a ceramic bowl with a corn stalk growing out of it. So we won't say there aren't any, But it's an interesting question. What are we looking at when we look at, some of this imagery of people, of animals, of clouds, what have you? On one hand, we're looking at rock art. On the other hand, we're looking at the kinds of images that appear in a painted medium, in Kiva murals and the rest of it. But more precisely, we're looking frequently at the kinds of geometric forms that actually have a kind of media root in basketry, in textile production. And pottery has its own background in textile production. So we see loads of pendant triangles in the rock art. We see loads of pendant triangles on pottery. All of that goes back to a deep media history that links to basket weaving, So it's really actually hard to say, do we see like pottery images on this rock art? Well, yes, but pottery images are actually basket images, and the basket images are actually cloud images, and cloud images are actually, it's about setting up an ecology that does important work for you as a farmer who needs to be plugged into the cosmos. That's how I feel.
Okay. So it looks like we've got a hand raised by Christiane Rivel. I hope I got that right. Lindsay, do you want to give her a microphone?
Yes. Hi, Seb. It's Chris Rivelis. How are you?
Hi. Good to hear you.
I had two questions. First, looking at the cloud bearer. Of course, I'm a docent at Mesa Prieta, and we're always talking about that image. And I was wondering if your informant had anything to say about the snake crossing the figure.
Thank you for that question. Yeah, no, we didn't talk about that, and I felt like it would be inappropriate for me to talk about that, to ask that question, even though, of course, I'm one of these archaeologists. You always want to be asking probing questions about everything, but sometimes not appropriate. I know that's on the tours at Mesa Prieta. It's quite famous sort of image, and I think my advisor and mentor Dick Ford, who's basically, along with my Pueblo colleagues, taught me everything I know, has had conversations around that panel. But no, I can't offer any kind of, exposition on it. It's fascinating. And again, like I'm trying to do a little dance here and talk about formal qualities of rock art that we can interpret without going into the esoteric, meanings behind them. So I think there's a lot of interpretive work we can do without actually, treading into space that would be inappropriate. And
I agree with you. We sometimes suggest, but we never say for sure. And my other question is that beautiful glyph with the Paho stick. And, we learn that things are often additive. And I was wondering if you thought that the Paho bearer might have been done earlier and then the word Paho added later.
That would help in the interpretation of it, but I don't think it's true. So we've actually been quantifying, we've been, taking visual imagery and quantifying numerically the difference in patina, in pecked areas versus non-pecked areas. This is the way of trying to reckon relative age. They're exactly the same. So it looks like it was pecked in the same hand, and by every indication that we can, monitor, this was created all at once. Indeed, even the spacing of it seems to be. And that's just super interesting because I just haven't seen Pueblo imagery that incorporates text like this. And the fact that there's that speech bubble seems to kind of imply to me that this was really a kind of meta commentary on a new world of engagement with textual language. The serif font, I have reasons for dating it between 1860 and 1945, to be honest. We've done a lot of work on this, my colleague Daryl Wilkinson in particular. But I would say it has to actually be, I think, after 1890, which is when the Santa Fe Indian School started. So I'd probably say this is an early 20th century image that we're looking at.
Thank you.
Sorry that I mangled your name, Chris, but one of the interesting things about doing this online is we've had participants from 4 or 5 or 6 countries, so I don't always know which language I'm dealing with when I see somebody's full name. There's another hand raised, and I think I'll get this one right. It's Claudia Brittenham. Claudia, do you want to ask a question?
Hi, Seb. Thank you so much for this wonderful talk. You've said a little about this in questions already, but can you talk more about what an image is in this context? I've found myself thinking about ways that we might think about defining images in Mesoamerica or in the Andes that look really different from what we think an image is in our current context.
Right. Yeah. Hi, Claudia. Thanks for that question. You asked a hard question. This is, I should say actually that this is one piece of a book that I'm collaboratively writing with Lindsay Montgomery, Daryl Wilkinson, and Ben Alberti. It's a book with 9 chapters, each of which tries to answer the question, what is an image for this particular, rock art tradition in the Gorge? And so we're tracking how that answer changes. There are lots of ways, I think, to begin to address this. On one hand, I do think that there's something fundamental about that shift from a kind of focus on indexicality. There's a kind of indexical logic to the archaic rock art. I regard an image as an arrow, something that points in a certain kind of direction in the archaic. In the Puebloan world, I really think that these are images that make you present in the moment, as it were, in the way that a prayer makes you present in the moment. So I think it's not doing the same kind of work. It's not an arrow leading you somewhere else, as in the case of the archaic tradition. Rather, we could think about it, an image as a prayer. We could think about an image as a song, and there are reasons in some Puebloan traditions for thinking about every image as a kind of song. But I am really taken with this idea of, an image as an iconic infrastructure. And here, I don't want to only link it to that sense of opening up pathways for water to arrive to your fields. It's almost as if archaic rock art opens up pathways for you to go outward, and Pueblo rock art opens up pathways for water to come to you. There's a reversal there. But I do see there, and I'm thinking here globally about the way Neolithic folks engaged with, farmers engaged with images. I think there's something about not pursuing bodies, but of producing, growing bodies that leads you to think iconically. And so, yeah, what is an image? It's an icon. It's an icon that opens up, a way for, in this case, moisture to come to you rather than for you to go to the game.
Harn asked the question, is there a Rosetta Stone that can help us with interpreting Puebloan rock art?
Yeah, they're called like Pueblo Friends and Colleagues. Those Rosetta Stones exist. They're like, they're folks hanging out in many of the Pueblo communities today. And, we're really lucky and honored when some information is shared with us. There is just so much that purposely isn't being shared, that can't be shared, and I think that's the real challenge for folks, like myself, who feel like it's important to engage. I mean, morally, I think it's actually really important to, acknowledge all of this Puebloan, artistry out there on the language. It's a way of claiming the space for Pueblo people. It's a way of inserting them into the histories that we write of North America. I regard it as ethically and morally vital that we actually study this material. God forbid Pueblo people weren't part of, the history of this part of the world. At the same time, one can, misstep and share things that shouldn't be shared. So anyway, at the same time that we want to study it, I think in, in formal art historical terms is probably the safest way. We want to set those Rosetta Stones that happen to be people, aside and say, whatever you'd like to share, great. Whatever you choose not to share, so be it.
Paula says, I'm familiar with some archaic horizontal panels on Rome Mesa. I think I've seen those too on a trip with Dick Ford. She says they were almost completely covered with grid-shaped images, no bird tracks, no squiggles. How do you interpret those?
Well, of course, the way that most people interpret that kind of, well, it's referred to as entoptic imagery by a lot of archaeologists who are enchanted with what's called the shamanic hypothesis, right? The interpretation of this kind of imagery as a technology to assist in shamanic trance or entering into shamanic trance. I think that argument is really overplayed, to be honest. There is a lot of geometric imagery that has immediately been interpreted as part of the kind of, stage one sort of trance imagery that appears before your eyes, just biologically. And I've looked at a lot of the sort of imagery that's coded in that way, like lines of dots going across a boulder face. Well, if you're a hunter, that's what game trails look like, lines of dots of scat. There's a lot that's linked into how hunters track game by looking at different natural signs of various sorts. Okay, so I think a lot that's been interpreted as an entoptic technology for facilitating, entrance into shamanic trance, I think it's been misread. That said, you pointed to the latter glyphs. Those I have a hard time explaining in terms of hunting logics, or in terms of indexical tracks. I would still perhaps say that they functioned indexically to help perhaps, those who were, exploring shamanic spaces to move towards those spaces. So thinking about them as kind of arrows that point towards the spirit realm might be an interesting way of looking at it. But yeah, I'm at the beginning stage of rereading all of that stuff that we much too comfortably interpreted as like shamanic art in the pragmatics of hunters' lives, which I think is what's, really needs to happen first.
We're getting towards the end, so I probably won't get to all the questions. Here's a great one from Katie. She says, thank you very much for this fabulous talk. Is this shift from indexical to iconic signs with the Neolithic transformation found elsewhere or everywhere, or is it somehow specific to the corn Lifeway? It would be the case. I mean, it happened in, many centers of domestication. Can this evidence be seen in these other locations?
That's such a great question. One of the great frustrations I have is that we have a kind of global conversation about the economics of the Neolithic Revolution. We don't yet actually have, and for all the graduate students out there, this is something for you to dive into. We don't yet have, a real global conversation about the iconographic aspects, the aesthetic aspects of the Neolithic Revolution. Now, Esther Pastore, an art historian at my own home institution who used to teach there at Columbia, produced some really beautiful work that she actually placed in dialogue with Robert Canero's evolutionary, theory. And she tried to look at how images changed over the course of the movement through evolutionary time. And that was a kind of start. And she really did argue that around the world there was a kind of logic that brought together a lot of Neolithic village-paced image traditions. Masking, for example, becomes very big in a lot of farming villages. We're humans, right? Like, we don't follow rules, slavishly. There are, as we all know, Paleolithic folks who drew beautiful iconic images. Interestingly, those Paleolithic Europeans didn't, indulge in imagery of the human body terribly much. And when they didn't present an image of the human visage. They had a real hesitancy towards the face. So there are some interesting patterns here and there, but when we look at the Neolithic, things change. If you look to early Chinese farming villages, you find masks that look almost identical to the Kachina masks of the Pueblo world. If you look to the ancient Near East, to the early farming villages, you find once again images that stare out at you through goggle eyes. This is part of a global human response, I think, to life, the resonating life of living in villages and growing, your food. So there is a big conversation to have there that we're just beginning.
Let's end with a question that Sarah poses, and it's an interesting one. Is there evidence of Pueblo interest in archaic rock art? Multiple instances of carving the same place, additions, erasures made to earlier images, layered imagery, etc. I mean, so in your experience, what do living Pueblo people think about the archaic, what we call the art, or what you've called the archaic rock art?
Yeah, there's one thing that I can, I'll make 2 points here, and they're both from friends, native friends, and I'm not going to identify their names because, I'm not sure if that would be appropriate, but I think it's safe to share. One Pueblo friend, this is a friend from Taos Pueblo, when we were discussing precisely this issue, launched into a really, really remarkable conversation about notions of prophecy. the idea that some images were created long in the past, and the artist might not even have known what prophecies were bound up within those images. It was only at a later time period when the meaning of those images would become known. And we happen to be looking in particular at images in which there were both archaic, glyphs, as well as later Puebloan glyphs. And, he very directly said, this might have been, some Pueblo folks, some of my ancestors, he said, coming and acknowledging that the prophecies that were laid out in that early imagery had come true. There, I give you one way of thinking about that interaction. Here's one more. This is from a friend. This comes from a friend at Ancestral Pueblo. He was in the audience at a talk I gave on Archaic Rock Art. We went out for dinner afterwards. And, he leaned over and said, okay, you foolish, white archaeologist. He didn't say, he was quite kind. But you foolish white archaeologist from the East who never went hunting in his life because you grew up in this peacenik kind of household and never touched a gun. You need to go hunting with me, is what he said. Because all of that archaic rock art with those animal prints, there's a lot of information there, and I could read those tracks for you if you want. So we still haven't yet gone out tracking game together, but suffice it to say that there's still hunters in the Pueblo world who know how to read natural signs in a much more robust way than someone like me who's never picked up a gun in his life. So yeah, there's a lot there.
Well, Severin Fowles, thank you so much for a really engaging presentation. I'd like to thank everybody. We had a great crowd. We were close to 200 people at some point, and many of you hung in to the end. So thank you for your attention and your interest, and I look forward to being with you on many more such events. Again, Sev, thanks a million, and I look forward to seeing you in happier days when we can actually meet in person.
Yes, well, thanks for your office anyway.
All right, bye-bye.